Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. We have a special guest here who's going to give us a talk. I'll introduce him in a moment. This program with Professor T.V. Paul from McGill University is co-sponsored by the Columbia China Center for Social Policy, the Harriman Institute here in the International Affairs Building, and my China and the World program, also based here. We're really lucky today to have a very distinguished speaker who comes to us from McGill University, T.V. Paul. You know someone's distinguished when they work at a university called McGill University and they are the McGill Professor in political science. They don't just give that away lightly. He deserves that kind of honor. He's been president of the International Studies Association, which is one of the great international relations organizations in the world. And he's also the founding director of the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. He is the author or editor of 24 books, and his most recent is The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi. Today's talk is on status recognition and great power conflicts, US, China, and Russia today. And I just want to let everybody know in the room and online, this is unusual for a China and the World event. The talk and the Q&A will all be recorded. So you should know that you're being recorded. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our great colleague and my friend, T.V. Paul, and we're so thrilled to have you here, and you should come more often.
Tom. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And it is wonderful to be back here. I was here in 2014, selling my book on Pakistan, The Warrior State. Professor Robert Jervis, who kindly organized at that time, Jack Snyder was also here, a seminar like this, but not this elaborate. And this place especially holds dear in the sense many of the scholars who taught here, studied here, some actually became colleagues, have some connections with people like me, especially Bob and Jack and Tom. And it is wonderful to be back and talk about this new project I'm working on. It is not a done deal. I'm still in my early stages. So whatever I'm going to say are preliminary and quite a bit theory focused at this point. The empirics are still in the development. I want to thank Chin Gao, who professor in the social policy and social work, who took the initiative to invite me. And unfortunately, today she's not well, so hopefully she's watching from home. But thank you, Chin, for this great honor. So I have a longstanding interest on the subject of status politics, and that's continuing. The last book was on India as may need more.
Use the mouse to click to the second slide.
The mouse.
The mouse.
This mouse. Okay, thank you very much. I have a continuing interest on the issue of status in international politics. Some years ago, a colleague who came from this program too, Deborah Larson and I co-edited a book called Status in World Politics. In fact, Debbie was the one who sort of introduced me to this theme, and I have since then been quite enamored by this concept. And it hasn't been used effectively in the IR literature, although the graduate applications and the reviews, manuscripts I get overwhelmingly showing there's a big interest, resurging interest all over the world. And so the India book was my effort to look at India's search for status using the status prism, and I hope you will find that interesting. So the current project is, I'll tell you in a few minutes what I'm trying to achieve here, but the world order is really in a bad shape not as bad as 1920s or 30s, but we are in a very anxious moment. The transition points are really hardening. and the relationship between Russia, the West, China, US, all suggest a great amount of conflict is happening and in the making. And we just hope that it won't lead to a catastrophic conflict of war in that sense. Status has been a neglected topic, as I mentioned, especially with respect to the behavior of great powers. There is literature that talks about power transition, Thucydides, trap, etc. But the main attention is on power, security, and other dimensions of international politics. So my argument in this book is, or potential book is, that great powers are status animals, if you want to prove. They are there because they have been accredited, given a particular role in a social sense. So gaining, retaining, and not abandoning is a big part of great power. Day-to-day politics as well, but often it is not, as Gilpin says, prestige, uses the word prestige, is the day-to-day politics of international politics. But Gilpin doesn't go too much into many details that some of us are trying to fill in. Then the question arises, why countries seek status, and in this context, great powers? And that question has been in the minds of many, even theoretical people as well as policy people. Why do they do it? So there are 2-3 explanations for it. One is psychological, intrinsic psychological value, fulfill certain social cravings, deference, respect, etc., or what you call collective self-esteem. Especially if you're a large entity with a civilizational, historical background, they are prone to have this ambition to be respected. Of course, there is a material benefit, which is very important here. It increases the capabilities of the state concerned, incentivize special rights, because others give it special rights, and opportunity to shape and control the behavior of others. And of course, that means less intervention in their own affairs. And a third one, neglected again in the discipline, is the calculations of the leaders who are pursuing status politics. Domestic legitimacy is very important for leaders, as we know, even in non-democracies. So a leader who brings status can gain quite a bit of domestic legitimacy. Now that I did the book on India, we read everything about Modi, quite a bit of that popularity he has is the impression that he has generated among the Indian electorate that he is the one who is bringing India higher status and acceptability. We can debate about that, but that is sort of the thing. And I go into the kind of a definition of status to begin with, drawing from our previous work, is the collective beliefs about a country's ranking in terms of valued attributes. So it is beliefs of others, perceptions of others, not oneself. So if you are in a hierarchically organized international or institutional structure, recognition has to come from others of the position of this entity. So status, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. That's why it's very clear that one cannot claim a status holder. It has to be ascribed. Power is the ability to influence outcomes, choices of others, going by Robert Dahl. But the relationship between power and status is intricate because if you have power, the assumption is you get status, but that is not automatic. Power holder cannot get social recognition. It takes quite a bit of effort, socialization of others, and that is a big problem in IR. But if you're a status holder, it's easier to get power. So that's the assumption. The reverse is not the case. I use a definition of great power in terms of the most capable states, old definition of Jack Levy, in providing or depriving security to others. But in modern times, it's about comprehensive national power plus status and hard and soft power, economic, technological help, etc. Determining global security and global political economy. But you see the skewed nature of the current crop of great powers. Russia has coercive power, but not the economic power. So that is a big challenge in going by the typical definitions. But clearly, coercion or coercive power worked in the past, the industrial era great powers. Today, that may not be so easy to accomplish your goal, as Russia is finding out. Now, the status holders can engage in violence towards each other, high status holders, and that is the peer group violence, toward lower ranking actors that challenge their status. So if you want to talk about Ukraine, Ukraine's unfortunate position, it is challenging Russia's status, but from Ukraine's point of view, it is the notion of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, etc., is critical for it. And that those two are the idea of great power, status-driven norms that's very much based on spheres of influence versus the sovereign equality are contesting. So high status groups offer very rarely they give status to other members, and that is a big problem. So great powers like to have the status to themselves, just like class groups, aristocratic upper class, caste groups, Brahmins don't want to give away power, or even lower ranking caste. Gender, you know that very well. Race. So it's very difficult once you hold status, it's difficult to give away easily. And international politics, it is a very difficult thing to give away. Peer group members need to recognize you to gain especially the most powerful peer group member. So there is a literature on social identity. I won't go into it, using social mobility, social competition, social creativity, etc., for attaining the membership. Max Weber's discussion about status groups, social formations based on common social honor and status are relevant here. But spheres of influence is a cardinal idea of great power, which sometimes we gave away to the idea of the sovereign equality, territorial integrity, etc. But the European system privileged the sphere of influence. If you go back to the concept of Europe, a few states had certain rights, others did not have. And so it's kind of a group territory idea, and that is contested by other norm of sovereign equality. So what you're witnessing in the Ukrainian crisis is the contestation between two norms. So what is accommodation? When a great power accommodates another one, it's the mutual acceptance by major power, especially toward a rising power, elimination of substantial hostility between them, and that includes status adjustment, mutually accepted norms and rules. And you have very few cases of peaceful status accommodation in history. The only one that stands out is the US, UK, late 19th, early 20th century. The partial one is US, China, 1970s, and even partial one, US, India, nuclear accommodation in the 1990s. So IR theory is, as I mentioned, is weak on this accommodation idea. The prejudice is against accommodation because accommodation is treated equivalent to appeasement. And so the question is, when is accommodation not appeasement? And that is becoming important here in the world today. Great power status is a key identity marker. Its loss, its depreciation, or humiliation, and can generate extraordinary domestic challenges. It is not just international, and the leader who lost it can be really in bad shape. The leader who gains it can create much more success. Identity crisis of a great power is very important. Status loss is a big part of it. So there are several types of status issues here. Some are established powers that worry about declining status. What do you call the status anxiety, that things could go bad, we need to do something. The one that is losing it can also fear status loss and misrecognition and even humiliation. The rising power is also under extraordinary status anxiety points in time. So I borrow from John Mearsheimer's book on the tragedy of great power politics, great powers. You probably have seen that book. I call it the tragedy of great power status politics. I think Mearsheimer's account about the violent conflict that is inevitable among great powers is quite interesting and challenged by many. But he doesn't mention the word status in it, which, as far as I know, which is a big mistake. I think that's the mistake of realism, except classical realism and Gilpinian realism. There is a mismatch there. Great power challenges is the tendency to look at power and security as the core issues is very much part of the realist tradition. And because that automatically gives status, that's another wrong assumption. And so we will see that great powers are driven by multiple status objectives. And they have what you call generate strategic interaction problem, drawing from Schelling's idea. And this idea is that just like when you do something, deterrence is the core argument there. You expect what others would do to you, that your expectation, your behavior is based on the expectation you may have. And so I have two types of reciprocity and recognition as part of this strategic interaction. One is what the great power expects when it, for instance, initiates a peace move, that it is expecting reciprocity and accommodation. States offer or accept peaceful strategies with the expectation that their opponent will reciprocate their benign gesture and will not take advantage. Material weakness may be a reason for the states to engage this, but it is clear that that alone is not enough. And so then you have another expectation that is also expectations of opportunity, that states propose ideas, especially rising powers, that they are rising and therefore their capabilities would be recognized and they will expect a recognition from the established powers. Neither can happen. For a period of time, they can happen. Then the material strength of the rising power could increase. And at that point, it expects more status recognition. We are at that point with respect to China and the United States. And even Russia, with Putin thought Russia's power was increasing, it needed more recognition. So the relationship between material strength and status is very intricate, and especially in generating expectations of reciprocity and accommodation. That's sort of the argument. Relative material decline can also generate considerable status anxiety. The President Trump's MAGA movement is clearly an example of that. Relative decline is, if not corrected, American primacy will erode. So expected status decline can be reverted, and the electorate, at least a group are agreeing with it. Allies and adversaries will kowtow. When they do not, that can generate status disenchantment. And so my worry about the United States is they are unlikely to kowtow. And over time, if this policy persists, it can create considerable disenchantment in the domestic society of the United States. So now the expectations are not just out of, okay, I want to bring a little bit about actually heavily influenced by Jack Snyder's work on domestic coalitions as an intervening variable. What happens is lack of reciprocity generates disenchantment in domestic opposition, and powerful coalitions or new regimes abandon peaceful strategies because they think that the other is not recognizing you. And this idea of log-rolling coalitions, largely internal process, needs to be expanded because the source could be external. Because I think most of the literature on domestic coalitions do not give adequate importance to that external source or external pressure, especially when different coalitions winning. And I think it's also a problem with comparative politics, literature on populism, democratic backsliding, deglobalization. They do not give importance to the international level variables. And I think that is a weakness of our disciplines becoming more compartmentalized. We were thinking of people like Huntington or Hoffman could bring in these dimensions, and even Gilpin, for instance. And that compartmentalization is really doing us harm. And I'm saying this because I know many of you are comparativists, probably because the comparativists are not paying attention to the international dimensions of status conflict, international conflict, and vice versa. I mean, we do a lot more. Actually, IR was blamed for some point, but now we are paying a lot more attention to domestic politics than the other way around. This is just a little crib of my side because I have colleagues who are really doing this job, and I'm appreciative of that, but they need to listen to the IR part. So the great powers have this social identity that comes out of the European great power system. This is another dimension that is not properly paid attention to. The international system in the 18th and 19th centuries privileged a small group of states, often winners, but even losers. Napoleonic France was in concert in Vienna. And it is also tied to the standards of civilization ideas based on Christian legal code. The Congress of Vienna, the concert system, the League of Nations, and then, of course, the UN Security Council all legitimize this idea of status quo. Entry rules, behavior, all that are prescribed in the Vienna system, exclusive and impermeable in many ways. And there are, of course, written and unwritten codes in this great power idea. And so there's a scholar called Roren who calls it generates hubris identities, that it is a very powerful thing to think about. You belong to that particular group. Now, I mentioned that the European great power system created this idea, but then the question is, why is that the established powers rarely give concessions sufficient enough to incorporate rising powers in a peaceful way? The temptation exists among established powers not to fulfill their commitments, or they demand too high a price as they expect the weaker adversary to weaken further. And so they may offer some partial concessions, then they will view that as generous. The established side could also see domestic coalitions that don't want to make timely concessions. The fear, of course, is the domino theory. Concessions could lead to further concessions. Then I think it's also the fact that established powers have legitimacy in the system. This is Snyder and Deising's argument. Status quo offers established powers a kind of legitimacy. They tend to value their status even higher than the challenger as a result of loss aversion. So loss aversion, it's very difficult to give away your status, marker status. So perceived legitimacy makes you feel what you're doing the right thing, rightness. And the willingness and wrong, if the other side then becomes less right, and the legitimacy they don't have creates problems. So perceived balance of legitimacy states that defend clear and long-established status quo have an edge, and that we know in the international system. And they think that costly signals are needed to defend the status quo. That would include raising the military conflict to a different level. So William Wohlforth has argued that just like security dilemma, you can get status dilemma also. that is increasing efforts by one side to increase the status generates or decrease the other side, and mutual spiraling effects would happen. So that much for my theory, and I'm trying to, my case studies are rather rudimentary at this point. Accommodation do happen sometimes, we can talk about that, but often not the case. I'm going to very briefly, since I have only 10 minutes to talk, 5 minutes on Russia, 5 minutes on China, very much stuff you already know. So the big question mark is, what was Gorbachev's expectations when he initiated glasnost and perestroika? And did he expect reciprocity and concessions? And what happened? The Western non-recognition of those aspirations, including non-fulfillment of verbal commitments, some of them were not written down, did that create an interaction that was positive first, now turning it into highly negative again? One quote I was inspired by is, as the aspiration to join the West as a democratic great power peer. Great power peer was important in the Gorbachev scheme. So the Western non-reciprocity, initially, yes, reciprocity up to a point, but then steadily changed with the NATO expansion. But the Russians wanted this pan-European security mechanism, and the Western effort was that Russia is materially weakening, that it will not be a challenger, but it could be in the future. Therefore, you need to protect these newly emerging democracies. Okay, there is a liberal dimension to that as well. But NATO's expansion was a status diminishing action from the point of view of Russia. Before Putin, of course, it was in a different manner expressed. Russian elite did not view concessions by Gorbachev as tantamount to defeat. Yeltsin, of course, there is a Yeltsin-Clinton strategic engagement, failed the attempt because capability was not there, or his inability to communicate properly. Kennan warned in his letter to Stolbert that Russia will reorganize. It cannot easily give this status away. He doesn't use the word, but many things I have read suggest that it is in the Russian DNA, identity of a great power. It cannot live without it. It needs that recognition, which is outdated, we all know, but unless it is completely defeated and transformed, as in the case of Japan and Germany, this may go on. Putin's attempt initially, by the way, Putin was for reconciliation, but it started, I guess, with the Georgian attack. Further, of course, the NATO intervention, Putin was not there. And then Ukraine's resistance, attempt to join NATO, EU, that really challenged the sphere of influence, and it is posed as an existential threat. And so the Russian economy got stronger. Now, this story is, some people say, misreading the economic strength because of oil price and things like that. And then, of course, from there, this collapse has been happening, and the Ukrainian political change also was not in Russia's favor. And so the problem for Russia is a truncated great power, but it really thinks that it has to be recognized on its own merit. And therefore, this conflict, how it will end, will have tremendous implications for peace and order in the years to come. Some people say if Russia wins, then they will try to expand this conflict. It loses, that also will produce high level of disenchantment internally. So, China. This story is also interesting, but to China's credit, China has been trying to be part of the globalized world order, benefiting from it. And so the challenge is quite a bit different. I go into Deng's strategy, economic reforms, modernization, every domain. And the goal was obviously take your time and then get there one day. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao continued the strategy to a great extent to become an attractive pole. But I think by 1997, the idea of a responsible great power was in China's lingo. And so peaceful rise strategy 2003, but then changed to peaceful development. International environment is an opportunity for that. And the idea that it is a kind of a social creativity-based strategy. China's rise won't pose threats to other states, gain status through soft power mechanism, while improving hard power assumption was that others will reciprocate and accommodate. And so other countries will invest and benefit from it. But you can see Hu Jintao period onwards, more assertiveness coming into the picture. Since, so the policy, the US response was since Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Senior, and Junior, all based on partial accommodation and integration of China. This is actually where I would like some insights probably from my colleagues here. What was the American expectation? And the more I read about it is Bill Clinton's justification for China joining WTO. This is a strong capitalist economy will produce a middle class that will demand democratic freedoms, and that US would remain status primacy. In other words, whatever the Chinese do, they're not going to get there. It will be the US still number one. By linking Chinese economy with the US, both would be benefited because that's the economic independence idea coming out of the liberal international idea. And the intensified globalization, of course, we all know the story. China was successful in producing cheap products and components for products, and increasingly talking about replacing American hegemony. China did become part of the international organizations. A lot of changes took place. I think the period that was most challenging is this idea of partial, the pivot strategy of Obama. That's again, the first indication that the US now is seriously talking about balance of power, despite the engagement part in it. China, of course, increased the defense spending, and some argue we are in a kind of a pre-World War I situation where the US power, UK's power was based on Navy, whereas today's and German efforts to surpass that, caused that friction in that sense. Here, we don't know whether a substantial increase in Chinese naval power will affect American tendency or approach towards China. So Xi Jinping's partial abandonment of this peaceful rise, partial I say because I think there are some elements of peaceful rise even in BRI, to be very honest. And so it is conditional on reciprocity by others. And of course, the organizational changes and the statecraft in BRI, a rapid change in China's relative position. And it's still not abandoning globalization. That is very much an important thing. And that is partially keeping peace in East Asia or whatever peace you want to call it. But I think China is experiencing status anxiety of a different kind. And it is reflected in its behavior in Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, India border, etc. It is another issue. So material capability, the more China advances, it is going to put enormous stress on the established powers and their allies. What do we do? And the technological advances are happening so rapidly. And now the US leaders, some of them, are looking at China as an existential challenge. Existential challenge not only to the US economy or domestic sphere, but also its status. And AI and other technologies will affect, just like tanks and aircraft in the past or other industrial era changes happen to the primes. So President Trump has imposed tariffs, reciprocal tariffs happening, we know, with considerable reciprocal ideas about what others would do. And this is where the big problem, I think we think about the strategic interaction problem in a way. So then, of course, the domestic politics, Trump saying in 2020, if I don't win the election, China will own the United States. There is an existential tone there. And so I will not go into the other cases I have here, given the small time I have. this I consider as a quintessential example of a country that could decline and the perception of decline. And this is status anxiety, and abandonment of liberal order is also because of the expectation that that order has not brought the status that at least a segment of the elite in this country view, and prosperity. So then I'm hoping to have a very quick reading of Bismarck to 1945 to see what led, whether status was a big part of the German story, the Japanese story. This I know very much the status story. Let me conclude because I'm already 33 minutes. Great power, status conflict, international conflicts. The problem with the realist grand strategies, most of them are based on balance of power, containment, and deterrence with the adversary, for instance. They assume accommodation is not feasible or desirable. And they could view challenger engaging in provocative and aggressive behavior need to be contained as well as balanced. Liberal instruments, institutions, economic interdependence, democratic norms, etc., or even the rules-based order, assume that the challenger can be tamed or accommodated. And so that differences between these two schools we know exist, but could be teased out. Where is the base of these rationale assumptions they are making? The big question is power transition conflict inevitable? Can historical lessons be sufficient to prevent war, even disruptive crisis? So the sustaining peace would require socialization of equal peace and status based on reciprocity. And here is the problem. Will there be an accommodation between the US and the West with China and Russia? How to fashion that international order with coexistence as the concept of different types of powers, reduce points of tension, mutual recognition of power as well as status aspirations. What's the role of the second ranking powers in it? And so the fear that China has today, that the US wants to keep it down, but Beijing, the US fear is Beijing wants to replace the US. That is a status conflict. It's a multifaceted competition happening. And so it all depends on that. So accommodation versus appeasement, that danger exists, but non-accommodation actually can produce much worse outcomes than we understand. Because a war need not produce the winner success at the end. We know that the United Kingdom won World War II. We know what happened after that. The rapid decline, especially after the Suez Crisis and withdrawal, was very clear. The US relative decline will be further enhanced if there is a major conflict and war in the East Asia context or globally. And so it is in the interest of the established power to somehow prevent war. Of course, the other one may not be willing to go by your interest. But the question is, how do you do that when you have the capability, but the other guy doesn't have, but the other guy will get there? Now, I was reading the Goldman Sachs prediction, Chinese economy would surpass the US by 2035, and then, of course, remain on a peak for 15% or something. All these are projections. So how do we get this idea of a rising China on its part to get leadership role without fighting? If it succeeds, it will be historical and very important. And that depends on what China does. So actually quite a bit of the ball is on Chinese court. And so inclusion of others is very critical here as well, because this is not a trilateral or a bilateral issue. Other states are important players here. That is not the case in the European great power system, by the way. And so because you have now a number of others arising, India, Indonesia, Brazil, they all have, I'm just giving some examples, have some more agency They are not jumping into bandwagoning coalition. In fact, I believe they are preserving the world order today. If they join coalitions immediately, as happened during various conflict eras, the great power conflict could get much worse. So institutions are important here, but their golden era may be over. Continuous diplomatic engagement, building non-great powers to bring into this, because status is not desired by only great powers. The others also want a status in their domains. So let me conclude by this sober note that 20th century's biggest killer after natural disasters were wars, great power wars. 109 million people in 2 wars, some 40 million in proxy wars or regional wars. Of course, this century we haven't seen that much, except the US interventions in theaters produced according to the cost of war project. Some until mid-2024, 1 million deaths directly and 3.8 million indirectly, some 8 trillion to American economy, and of course to a lot. So this subject matter of status, accommodation, all these are life and death issues, more than simple glory for people's psychological reasons, but we need to bring in this subject and understand the social psychological basis for international conflict as an existential priority. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.